years following 1938 were no less turbulent for Spain, but for the Calderón household, they became years of adjustment, compromise, and silent endurance. What had begun as an unusual arrangement now transformed into a way of life. For the sisters, there was no turning back. They had crossed a line that society rarely forgave, yet within the confines of their home, it became normal, almost mundane. To outsiders, it was a scandal hidden in plain sight, but to them, it was the only path that ensured their family could survive the chaos that surrounded them. Their children were growing, their responsibilities were multiplying, and their bond as sisters was constantly tested by the reality of sharing a single man as husband. The husband, whose presence loomed like a pillar within the home, was both a unifying and dividing force. He commanded authority, but he also carried the weight of expectation. Providing for 2 wives and a growing number of children was no easy task, especially in a Spain that had been reduced to rations, poverty, and destruction by war. Yet somehow he managed. His days began before the sun rose, working in the mines, or laboring in odd jobs to secure enough food. His nights ended with exhaustion, but the sight of his children gathered around him seemed to justify the struggle. For him, this household was not merely an unusual arrangement, it was his pride, his achievement in the face of hardship. In the eyes of his community, he might have been judged, but inside his home, he was the axis around which everything revolved. For the sisters, the emotional balance was more fragile. At times, jealousy would slip in, subtle yet sharp, like a blade hidden under cloth. A glance, a gesture, a word shared more with one than the other. These small things threatened to unravel the delicate peace, but the bond of blood between them was strong. They had grown up together, shared a childhood, secrets and dreams. That bond often acted as a bridge over the cracks jealousy left behind. When conflicts arose, they were resolved not as rival wives but as sisters, each recognizing the impossibility of their situation and the futility of tearing the family apart. Their unity was survival, and they knew it. They lived in a world where survival was victory enough. The children, as they grew, became both a joy and a challenge. They did not fit neatly into categories, because in truth, they blurred them. Who was cousin, who was sibling, who was half-brother or half-sister? Such distinctions mattered little inside the Calderón home. The children learned early that they were one unit, bound by love and necessity rather than technical family trees. They played together, fought together, studied together, and when one was in trouble, all felt the weight of it. To them, their family was normal. It was only when they stepped outside, when whispers followed them in the narrow streets of Asturias, that they began to realize they were different. But even then, the sisters shielded them fiercely, never allowing gossip to taint their children's sense of belonging. By the 1940s, the Spanish Civil War had ended, but the shadow of dictatorship loomed large. Franco's rule reshaped society with iron discipline, strict Catholic morality, and silence imposed upon dissenters. In such a climate, the Calderón household had to tread carefully. Their arrangement was not something the authorities would ever condone if brought to light. Yet they managed to blend into the background, never drawing more attention than necessary, living quietly, working hard, and keeping their unusual family arrangement behind closed doors. Neighbors might gossip, but none dared to expose them, perhaps because everyone had secrets of their own in those years. In Spain, under dictatorship, silence became survival. Life in the Calderón home was marked by repetition and resilience. The sisters woke before dawn, one tending to breakfast while the other tended to children. Chores were endless: washing, clothes by hand, mending torn garments, carrying water, preparing food with whatever was available. Their days were filled with labor, but they shared the burden, never allowing one to collapse under the weight alone. At times, it almost felt like they were co-wives and co-mothers in the truest sense, each filling gaps where the other faltered. Their shared motherhood blurred lines not just for their children but for themselves. At night, when exhaustion settled over the home, there were moments of quiet when the sisters would sit together, sometimes in silence, sometimes exchanging stories of the past, remembering the days before their lives had taken such an unusual turn. Those moments, however brief, were reminders that beyond their roles as wives, they were still sisters, still bound by something deeper than marriage. The community around them adapted too. In small villages, people are rarely blind to what happens in their neighbors' homes. Everyone knew, or at least suspected, but life in Asturias was hard enough that few had the time or energy to police the private lives of others. Some whispered disapproval, others mocked, but many secretly admired the Calderón sisters for their strength. To manage such a household, to raise children, to endure the judgment of others, it required courage, and not everyone had it. Over time, gossip dulled into indifference, and the Calderón household was left to its own rhythm. It was in these years that the foundation of endogamy truly began. As the children grew, the sisters and their husband faced a new question. Whom would their children marry? The outside world was filled with risk. Marrying into other families meant opening the door to judgment, exposure, and potential shame. But marrying within, keeping the bonds tight, meant safety, continuity, and control. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Cousins were treated more like siblings, and marriages within the extended Calderón line became not just acceptable, but expected. The cycle of closed lineage began, and what started as a solution for one generation evolved into a tradition for the next. By the late 1940s, the Calderón home had expanded in numbers. Children ran through narrow hallways, laughter mixing with the cries of infants, the scolding of mothers, and the steady rhythm of life. Resources were always stretched thin, but somehow they managed. The sisters continued to share responsibilities, and though age began to etch lines on their faces, their bond remained steady. The husband, though older now, remained the figure around which everything rotated. His word was law in the household, but even he recognized that it was the sisters who held the true fabric of the family together. Without their cooperation, without their willingness to share him and share their burdens, the household would have collapsed long ago. The children grew into young adults in this unique environment, their sense of identity shaped by the unusual arrangement of their family. They carried with them both pride and confusion. Pride in their resilience, confusion in explaining to others what their family truly was. But inside, they were not ashamed. The sisters had raised them to believe they were strong, united, and chosen for something greater than ordinary life. That belief would fuel the continuation of their endogamous legacy as they married within the family and carried forward the lineage that had begun in silence during 1938. For the Calderón sisters, those years were a test of patience and faith. They knew that what they had done was not ordinary, not sanctioned by church or state, but they also knew it had given them a kind of strength no one else could claim. Their choice had created not only a family but a fortress, one that stood against war, dictatorship, and the judgment of society. And though they rarely spoke of it openly, both sisters understood that their lives had become a story. A story of survival, sacrifice, and the weaving of bloodlines so tightly bound that historians would one day look back in astonishment. The passing years did not erase the weight of what the Calderón sisters had chosen. Instead, they deepened its impact. By now, both women had accepted that their lives were permanently intertwined, not just by blood but by marriage, a reality that demanded constant compromise. Yet there was something remarkable about how naturally they moved within this arrangement. Where outsiders expected rivalry, they found cooperation. Where others would predict bitterness, they often discovered laughter in the quiet corners of their home. They raised each other's children as their own, blurring the boundaries so much that even the children themselves sometimes struggled to separate maternal roles. But perhaps that was precisely the point. The family had become so tightly woven that separation no longer existed. There was no yours or mine. There was only ours. Outside their walls, Spain was tightening under the control of dictatorship. Neighbors feared spies, priests preached morality, and yet in the secrecy of their home, the Calderons defied convention every single day. This defiance was not loud, not rebellious in the streets, but it was defiance all the same. Their very survival, their ability to raise a large and functioning family under circumstances that most would have called impossible, was itself a quiet rebellion. It taught their children that family was more than rules imposed by church or state. It was loyalty, unity, and endurance. And so, by the time the 1950s began to cast a new light on Spain, the Calderón household was no longer merely an oddity whispered about by villagers. It had become a legend of survival, and the roots of the most endogamous lineage in Asturias had sunk deep into the soil of history. The 1950s arrived in Asturias with the same mixture of hope and hardship that had defined the previous decades. For Spain as a whole, the Civil War was long over, but its echoes still haunted the lives of ordinary people. In villages and mining towns, people carried scars, some visible, others hidden deep within their memories. Yet, despite the dictatorship, despite the hunger that lingered and the silence imposed upon dissent, life found a way to push forward. Children grew, fields were tilled, mines were worked, and families like the Calderons carved out their existence within the narrow margins allowed to them. By now, the Calderón household was large, noisy, and filled with a mix of laughter and tension. The sisters, now well into middle age, had become pillars of their family, while the man they shared aged into a figure of respect and authority within the village, if not entirely free of judgment. What had once seemed like scandal now appeared, to outsiders, as something less shocking, not because it was accepted, but because it had become familiar. People grew accustomed to the sight of the Calderón children walking together to school, to the presence of two sisters managing one home, and to the quiet but firm influence their shared husband had on the community. Gossip, which once carried sharp edges, now dulled into murmurs. There were new scandals to whisper about, new dramas to entertain villagers. The Calderons, though unusual, no longer drew the same burning curiosity they once had. Instead, they became a story that people shook their heads at and then set aside, as though by ignoring it, they could protect themselves from the discomfort of something that challenged their sense of morality. Inside the home, however, the unusual arrangement continued to shape every detail of daily life. The children were now adolescents and young adults, and with their age came new challenges. Questions of identity began to emerge. Who exactly were they in relation to each other? The line between cousin, sibling, and half-sibling blurred to the point of vanishing. For the younger ones, it hardly mattered. They were united by the shared experience of growing up in a household where distinctions were erased. But for the older ones, stepping out into a world that expected clarity, the confusion grew heavier. When they met outsiders, when they spoke of their families, they often stumbled. How could they explain something that even they barely understood? The sisters did everything in their power to protect their children from shame. They reminded them, constantly that family was not defined by outsiders' judgments, but by love and unity. And yet, as adolescence always does, rebellion and questioning crept into the Calderón home. Some children demanded answers, pressing their mothers about why things were the way they were, about why their father belonged to both women, about why their family was different. The sisters responded with patience, though not always with clarity. How could they fully explain the choices they had made in the shadows of war? How could they describe the desperation of 1938 to children who had only known the relative stability of the 1950s? Still, they tried, weaving stories of survival, of loyalty, of sacrifice. The children may not have understood every word, but they absorbed the message. Their family existed because their mothers had been brave enough to defy the world. Meanwhile, the father's role shifted with age. No longer the young and vigorous man who had first married the eldest sister, he now carried himself with the weight of years and responsibility. His authority was still respected, but it softened around the edges. Where once his word had been law, now it was tempered by the influence of his wives, who had grown confident in their shared authority. Decisions were made collectively, with the sisters often steering the course of the family in ways subtle but unmistakable. He remained the figurehead, but they were the foundation. Without them, the family would crumble. It was during this period that the question of marriage for the next generation loomed large. The eldest of the Calderón children reached marrying age, and with it came the question of who their partners would be. For most families, this was a matter of arranging matches, securing alliances, or at the very least finding suitable partners from neighboring families. For the Calderóns, however, things were different. Marrying outside meant exposure, gossip, and the risk of outsiders entering their closed circle. The sisters, determined to preserve their family and protect their children from ridicule, encouraged unions within the extended family. Cousins became husbands and wives, their shared bloodlines, reinforcing the unusual origins of their parents. What had begun as an arrangement between two sisters and one husband now blossomed into a tradition of endogamy that would define the Calderón lineage for generations to come. At first, these marriages raised eyebrows even within the community. Whispers returned, judgments resurfaced, and questions were asked in hushed voices. But again, survival triumphed over scandal. The Calderón family was strong, numerous, and united. Their children were hard-working, respectful, and loyal. Slowly the murmurs lost their sting. Outsiders could whisper all they wanted, but the Calderóns did not crumble. If anything, they grew stronger. Each new marriage within the family tightened the bonds of loyalty and sealed the circle against intrusion. Over time, the line between family and identity became inseparable. To be a Calderón was to be part of something larger, something self-contained, something untouchable. The sisters, now mothers to grown children and grandmothers to infants, watched their lineage expand with a mixture of pride and weariness. Their faces bore the marks of years spent in labor and sacrifice, but their eyes still held the quiet determination that had carried them through the darkest days of 1938. They knew that what they had built was extraordinary, not in the sense of glory or fame, but in the sense of endurance. They had survived, and in surviving, they had created a family structure that defied norms and astonished all who learned of it. The 1950s rolled into the 1960s, and Spain itself began to change slowly, cautiously, under Franco's rule. The country's isolation began to crack as international influences trickled in, and new generations began to question the rigid traditions imposed on them. But within the Calderón home, change moved differently. The outside world may have shifted, but their family structure remained steadfast. The sisters had set a course decades earlier, and their children, willingly or not, followed it. The cycle of endogamy continued, tightening the web of bloodlines and creating a lineage that was perhaps more interconnected than any other in Spain. To those who studied family trees, the Calderón lineage became something astonishing. Cousins, married cousins, sometimes even closer relations, until the lines blurred entirely. What was once whispered a scandal now became a subject of fascination. Genealogists and historians years later would examine this family with wide eyes, marveling at the way one decision in 1938 had spiraled into such an extraordinary pattern. For the Calderón sisters, however, it was never about creating history. It was about surviving the present, about ensuring their children had families of their own, about keeping their bloodline intact in a world that had once threatened to destroy everything they held dear. The 1960s brought with them winds of change across Europe, and even in the remote corners of Asturias, traces of that transformation began to seep in. Roads improved, radios became more common, and young people started to dream of lives that extended beyond the boundaries of their villages. For the Calderón family, however, change was never straightforward. While the world outside expanded, their own world seemed to grow more tightly bound, sealed by the choices made decades earlier. The children who had married within the family now had children of their own, and so the cycle deepened. What had once been whispered about as scandalous had now crystallized into a tradition, one that few dared to question openly, even within the family itself. The two sisters, now entering old age, carried themselves with the quiet authority of matriarchs. They had been through everything together: the war, the hunger, the gossip, the endless labor of raising children. And now they found themselves presiding over a sprawling household of grandchildren. Their shared husband, older still, had receded into the background. He remained present, of course, a figure whose approval was still sought and respected, but it was clear to everyone that the real strength of the Calderón lineage now resided in the sisters. They had become living symbols of endurance, women whose bond had defied not just social norms, but the very expectations of what it meant to be family. Yet even as their influence grew, so did the pressures around them. The younger generations, exposed to new ideas through school, radio, and the occasional newspaper, began to feel the weight of being different. They loved their family, they respected their elders, but they could not escape the whispers they heard outside. Some classmates avoided them, some teachers looked at them with suspicion, and when they ventured into nearby towns, the curious stares never quite stopped. For some of the grandchildren, this bred resentment. They wondered why they could not simply be like other families, why their surnames and bloodlines had to be entangled in ways that set them apart. For others, however, it bred pride. They saw in their family something unique, something unbreakable, a lineage that had weathered storms no outsiders could understand. To be a Calderón for them was not a curse, but a mark of belonging to something larger than themselves. Conflicts naturally arose. Among siblings and cousins, disagreements sometimes flared over identity, over marriage choices, over the path their lives should take. A few dared to dream of leaving, of finding love outside the family, of breaking the cycle of endogamy that bound them so tightly. But those dreams rarely reached fulfillment. The grip of tradition, of loyalty, of obligation, was too strong. Even those who left for a time often returned, drawn back not just by family, but by the reality that outsiders rarely understood them, rarely welcomed them without judgment. Home, no matter how complicated, was still the only place where they fully belonged. During this period, the Calderón household became something of a fortress of memory. Stories of the past were told and retold, binding each generation to the struggles that had come before. The sisters spoke of 1938 as though it were yesterday, recounting the hardships of war, the hunger, the choices that had led them to share a husband. These stories served a purpose. They reminded the younger ones that their family was not strange for the sake of being strange, but had been shaped by necessity, by courage, by survival. Whether the children accepted this reasoning or not, they could not escape its weight. Their very existence was tied to those choices, and so every argument about identity circled back to gratitude and obligation. To question too deeply was to question the foundation of their own lives. By the mid-1960s, Spain itself was stirring under the weight of Franco's long rule. Economic development, often called the Spanish miracle, was transforming cities, opening industries and creating opportunities for migration. Young men left villages to work in factories, young women found employment in service jobs, and entire families relocated to urban areas in search of prosperity. For the Calderóns, this posed a dilemma. On the one hand, economic opportunity beckoned. On the other, leaving the village meant exposure. It meant loosening the tight bonds that had preserved their unity for decades. The sisters were wary. They had spent their lives defending the family against gossip and intrusion. To allow their children and grandchildren to scatter was to risk losing everything they had fought for. And so, once again, they encouraged choices that kept the family close, even if it meant sacrificing opportunities that others eagerly embraced. Still, some could not be contained. A few grandchildren ventured into the wider world, taking jobs in factories in Oviedo or even Madrid. They wrote letters home, sometimes visited during festivals, but they were never entirely free of the pull of the Calderón name. Marriages outside the family were rare but not entirely absent. When they occurred, they caused waves of tension within the household. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion, sometimes even hostility, as though their presence threatened to unravel the delicate balance that had been maintained for so long. Some of these marriages ended in separation, the outsider unable to adjust to the insular nature of Calderón life. Others survived but remained on the margins, never fully embraced. The sisters watched all of this with sharp eyes. They were old, now their bodies frail, but their minds still alert. They understood better than anyone the fragility of what they had built. They knew that the world outside was changing faster than their family could adapt. And yet, they also knew that their lineage was strong, that its roots were deep enough to endure. They did not try to stop the future entirely. They were not foolish. But they reminded their children and grandchildren at every turn that loyalty to family was the only true anchor in a world full of uncertainty. Their voices carried weight, not because they demanded obedience, but because they had earned respect through decades of sacrifice. As the decade wore on, the Calderón household remained a place of contradictions. It was both a refuge and a cage, a source of pride and of shame, a family united by love and divided by questions of identity. Outsiders might never have understood it, but for those within, it was life itself. They laughed together, worked together, celebrated together, mourned together. And though they argued, though they sometimes dreamed of escape, they always returned to the same truth. They were bound to one another in ways that could not be broken. Their lineage, born of scandal, sustained by endogamy, had become something larger than the sum of its parts. It was a testament to survival, to defiance, to the unyielding bond of two sisters who had once made an impossible choice, and in doing so, reshaped the destiny of their descendants. By the end of the 1960s, Spain was looking toward a new future, one that promised modernity and change. The Calderóns, however, remained anchored in their past. The sisters, now nearing the end of their lives, held their family close, watching as the generations they had raised spread their roots deeper into the soil of Asturias. They could not know what the future would bring, whether their unusual lineage would endure or fracture under the pressures of modernity. But they did know one thing. They had given their family a foundation of unity that no outside force had been able to destroy. Whatever came next, the Calderón name would carry, forward marked forever by the choices of 1938. The 1970s arrived in Asturias like a slow dawn, carrying with them both uncertainty and a faint promise of change. Across Spain, whispers of discontent against Franco's regime were growing louder, though in villages tucked deep into the mountains, politics often felt like a distant thunderstorm. Life was still measured by the rhythm of the seasons, planting, harvesting, tending livestock, celebrating festivals. But for the Calderón family, the decade carried a deeper sense of inevitability. The sisters, now well into old age, could feel their strength fading. Their bodies were tired from years of labor, their faces marked by the lines of endurance, but their spirits remained stubborn. They knew they were nearing the end of their journey, and with every passing year the question loomed larger: what would happen to their family once they were gone? The grandchildren, by now numbering in the dozens, filled the family home with noise and life. Some were still children, chasing each other through the fields, while others were young adults, grappling with choices their elders had once faced. Would they remain loyal to the lineage, marrying within the family, continuing the cycle of endogamy that had defined their existence for nearly 4 decades? Or would they take advantage of the opportunities that Spain's changing society was beginning to offer, stepping outside the closed circle that had both protected and constrained them? For the older generations, these were not just personal choices, but existential ones. The very identity of the Calderóns depended on how the young ones chose to live. The sisters had always been cautious about the outside world, but in their final years they softened in subtle ways. They no longer scolded as harshly when a grandchild expressed curiosity about city life. They no longer resisted as fiercely when one of the boys mentioned a job in Oviedo or Gijón. Yet, at the same time, they reminded their family constantly of the values that had sustained them through war: hunger and gossip, unity, loyalty, sacrifice. Their stories became lessons, repeated so often that even the youngest could recite them by heart. They spoke of 1938, of how they had shared a husband not out of scandalous desire, but out of necessity, to protect their family name and survive in a world that gave them no other choice. They framed their unusual union as an act of bravery, one that had shielded their descendants from ruin. Whether the grandchildren fully believed this or not, the weight of that narrative pressed heavily upon them. It was difficult to imagine betraying such a legacy. Outside the village, however, Spain was stirring with change. After Franco's death in 1975, the country entered its transition, a fragile yet exhilarating period that promised democracy, freedom, and modernization. For the Calderóns, this new Spain was both exciting and terrifying. Suddenly, taboos were being challenged everywhere. Women sought independence, young people demanded liberty, and the grip of tradition loosened in countless households. For a family like the Calderóns, built on an unconventional tradition of their own, the shifting tides brought new dilemmas. On the one hand, they were no longer as vulnerable to the judgment of others. In a world where everyone was questioning norms, their lineage seemed less shocking, less scandalous. On the other hand, the same freedom that reduced gossip also encouraged younger members to break away, to imagine lives unbound by the insular circle that had sustained them for so long. Conflicts began to simmer within the household. Some grandchildren saw no reason to continue the practice of marrying within the family. They argued that the world was changing, that the family no longer needed to protect itself from outsiders, that opportunities for education, work, and love lay beyond the village. Others resisted, clinging tightly to the familiar, fearing that, once the cycle was broken, the Calderón identity would dissolve into nothingness. These debates were rarely open confrontations. Respect for the elders still ran deep, but they shaped conversations around dinner tables, in whispered exchanges between siblings, in arguments carried out under the cover of night. The family, once united in its difference, was now beginning to fracture under the weight of possibility. The sisters sensed this tension and tried to hold their family together through sheer will. They hosted gatherings, encouraged rituals, and reminded everyone of their shared blood. Festivals became less about religion or village tradition and more about cementing family bonds. Birthdays, baptisms, weddings, each was transformed into a grand Calderón affair, an assertion of identity in a world that threatened to dilute it. Yet even these celebrations carried undercurrents of unease. When an outsider attended, perhaps as a friend or potential spouse of one of the grandchildren, they were met with polite smiles, but also with suspicion. The sisters tolerated their presence, but their eyes betrayed the same protective caution they had carried all their lives. They had spent too many years fending off judgment to trust easily. By the late 1970s, the inevitable came. First, one sister passed away, her death casting a shadow of grief across the family. For days, the house was filled with mourning, with prayers and tears, with memories recounted by every generation. The surviving sister, though devastated, carried herself with stoic strength. She knew that the family was looking to her now more than ever, that her presence alone was the glue holding them together. She became almost mythic in her final years, a living relic of the past, the embodiment of the choices that had shaped them all. Her words carried even greater weight, and when she spoke, the family listened with reverence, even when they disagreed. She reminded them constantly that their bloodline was not a mistake, not a scandal, but a monument to survival. It was her greatest fear that once she was gone, her descendants would scatter, abandoning the identity she and her sister had fought to preserve. As the decade drew to a close, Spain entered the 1980s with renewed optimism, but the Calderons entered it with uncertainty. Their matriarchs, the twin pillars of their lineage, were fading. The younger generations were restless, pulled in different directions by loyalty and desire, by tradition and freedom. The question of whether the family would continue its endogamous cycle or finally break away hung in the air like a storm cloud. And though no one could predict what the future held, everyone knew one thing. The passing of the last sister would mark the end of an era. What came after would be up to the children and grandchildren who stood at the crossroads between preservation and transformation. The Calderón story, born in scandal in 1938, was about to enter a new chapter, one no less uncertain, no less dramatic than the choices that had defined it from the beginning. The dawn of the 1980s brought a very different Spain than the one the Calderón sisters had known for most of their lives. Democracy was taking root, new freedoms were reshaping the culture, and a sense of modernity was trickling even into the most isolated corners of Asturias. Televisions became more common, radios carried news of political debates and international events, and young people were no longer confined by the narrow possibilities that had defined their parents and grandparents. For the Calderón family, however, this era was not simply about adapting to a changing country. It was about surviving the loss of the last sister, the final living link to the origin of their unusual lineage. When she finally passed, the grief was immense. The household that had always revolved around her presence suddenly felt empty, unanchored, vulnerable. The siblings and cousins, so accustomed to being guided by her firm yet steady voice, now faced life without a matriarch. And with her absence came the most difficult question yet. Would the family remain bound together by the strange pact that had defined them for over 40 years? Or would they drift into the broader currents of Spanish society? In the immediate aftermath of her death, the family tried desperately to maintain unity. They organized frequent gatherings, clung to traditions, and spoke often of the sisters' sacrifices, repeating the story of how it had all begun in 1938 as though invoking a sacred myth. Yet beneath the surface, the cracks were widening. The grandchildren, now adults in their 20s and 30s, were restless. Many of them had jobs in the nearby cities. Some were pursuing higher education, and others were forming friendships and romantic attachments with people far outside the family circle. The endogamous cycle that had seemed inevitable in the 1940s and 1950s now felt suffocating to some. They questioned why they should continue a practice that had once been born out of necessity, but now seemed increasingly out of step with the times. Their parents, who had grown up under the strict authority of the sisters, were torn between loyalty to tradition and love for their children's happiness. For the first time in decades, the Calderón identity was not a source of pride alone. It was a source of conflict. The younger Calderóns began to challenge unspoken rules in subtle but significant ways. Some brought outsiders to family gatherings, testing the waters of acceptance. Others openly courted lovers from outside the lineage, forcing the issue into the open. At first, these choices were met with silence, the family unwilling to dishonor the memory of the sisters by voicing disapproval too strongly. But silence did not mean acceptance. Tensions simmered. Behind closed doors, arguments erupted between siblings. One would defend the right to love freely. Another would accuse them of betraying their heritage. In public, they tried to present a united front, but anyone who looked closely could see the strain. The once impenetrable wall of Calderón solidarity was beginning to crack. Yet for all the conflict, there was also resilience. Some family members still chose to marry within, either out of genuine belief in the tradition or fear of what breaking it might mean. These unions, however, felt different than those of earlier generations. They were not driven by survival, but by loyalty, almost as if honoring the past outweighed the needs of the present. Outsiders viewed these choices with curiosity, sometimes with judgment, but increasingly with a shrug. In a Spain where counterculture movements were flourishing, where individuality was being celebrated, the Calderón story no longer provoked the same scandal it once had. Instead, it was just another eccentricity in a country suddenly full of them. The economic realities of the time also reshaped the family's options. The 1980s were not easy years in Spain, particularly in rural areas. Many young people migrated to larger cities in search of work, and some Calderón descendants were no exception. As they left the village, they carried with them the weight of their family's history, but distance inevitably weakened bonds. Those who settled in Oviedo, Madrid, or even abroad found themselves absorbed into new worlds where the Calderón name meant nothing. Some chose to keep their family's unusual past a secret, fearing ridicule or misunderstanding. Others wore it almost as a badge of honor, a story to tell at dinner parties, a quirk that set them apart from their peers. Either way, the move to the cities accelerated the dilution of the endogamous cycle. In the anonymity of urban life, love could be chosen more freely, and family expectations were easier to ignore. Back in the village, however, the atmosphere remained charged with memory. The family home, still standing though worn with age, became a kind of shrine to the sisters. Photographs of them lined the walls, their stories retold at every gathering, their absence felt in every silence. To some, this devotion was comforting. To others, it was oppressive. The younger generation, especially teenagers growing up in the 1980s, often felt trapped between reverence for their ancestors and the desire to carve out lives of their own. Some rebelled quietly, sneaking out to meet friends, refusing to attend every family gathering, speaking openly about wanting a different kind of future. Their elders reacted with worry, sometimes anger, but deep down, they knew change was inevitable. The world was pulling their children in directions they could no longer control. Still, the Calderón's spirit of resilience refused to vanish. Even as individuals broke away, the core of the family identity remained strong. They continued to gather in large numbers, continued to speak of themselves as a unit rather than as scattered branches. And though the endogamous cycle weakened, the sense of being different, of being Calderón, endured. In some ways, the family's uniqueness evolved from their unusual marital choices into something broader, a fierce loyalty, an unshakable pride, a refusal to forget where they had come from. Outsiders might no longer see them as scandalous, but within the family they still saw themselves as extraordinary. By the late 1980s, the Calderóns were at a crossroads. Some cousins had broken the cycle completely, marrying outsiders, having children who carried only half of the Calderón blood. Others held firm, insisting that the true lineage could only be preserved through unity. The family was no longer homogeneous, but it was not fractured beyond repair either. Instead, it existed in a state of tension, pulled between past and future, tradition and modernity, loyalty and freedom. And though no one could yet say which side would prevail, one truth was clear. The choices of this generation would define whether the Calderón story ended as a closed circle or transformed into something entirely new. As Spain moved into the final years of the decade, embracing prosperity and integration with Europe, the Calderón family faced its own integration into a broader society, into modern life, into a world their matriarchs could never have imagined. The sisters had fought to preserve their lineage against unimaginable odds, but their descendants now faced a different kind of battle. How to honor that legacy while still living fully in a world that demanded change. The answer would not come easily, and it would not come without loss. Yet as always, the Calderóns endured, carrying forward the strange, remarkable story that had begun with two sisters and one husband in 1938. The 1990s arrived with a surge of optimism in Spain, a country fully embracing its place within modern Europe. Roads were being rebuilt, schools improved, and technology began trickling into even the most remote villages. For the Calderón family, these years represented another turning point. The grandchildren who had once been restless teenagers were now adults, beginning their own families, navigating a new Spain where the past seemed less relevant and the future more uncertain. Yet, as much as the outside world evolved, the Calderón identity remained a powerful presence in their lives. Even those who had moved to cities often found themselves drawn back to the village for gatherings, compelled by the invisible thread of tradition. But each return home also carried with it a clash. The tension between modern love and ancestral duty, between integration into society and loyalty to the endogamous legacy that had shaped them for decades. One of the most visible shifts during this decade was education. More Calderón descendants attended universities than ever before, especially in Oviedo and Madrid. This exposure to new ideas, new people, and new possibilities transformed them in profound ways. In classrooms and lecture halls, they met individuals from across Spain and beyond, encountering cultures and perspectives that challenged the insularity of their upbringing. Many began questioning not only the practice of marrying within the family, but also the broader philosophy of closing ranks around their lineage. For some, the family's endogamous past became a source of embarrassment, something to conceal from friends. For others, it was a fascinating oddity, a story they shared with a mix of pride and disbelief. Regardless of how they framed it, the truth was that education opened doors that the sisters could never have imagined, and those doors rarely led back into the closed circle of Calderón unions. Still, education did not sever bonds completely. Quite the opposite. Some cousins who studied in the same cities formed even closer alliances, supporting one another as they navigated the challenges of modern urban life. They shared apartments, pooled resources, and maintained the old family habit of loyalty above all. Outsiders who encountered them often remarked on how unusually tight-knit they were compared to other families. Even without strict adherence to endogamy, the Calderón sense of solidarity proved unshakable. In this way, the spirit of the sisters endured, even if the practice that had once defined them was beginning to loosen. The 1990s also brought love stories that marked a dramatic departure from the past. Several Calderón descendants married partners from outside the lineage, something that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. These unions were celebrated with varying degrees of acceptance. Some branches of the family embraced the newcomers warmly, relieved that their children had found happiness. Others viewed them with suspicion, as if every outsider represented a dilution of the sacred Calderón bloodline. At weddings, this tension was palpable. Guests whispered in corners, some praising the courage of breaking tradition, others lamenting what they saw as the end of an era. Yet the fact remained, the circle was opening, whether everyone liked it or not. Children born of these unions became symbols of both hope and controversy. To the more progressive members of the family, they represented the natural evolution of the lineage, blending Calderón's strength with fresh perspectives. To the traditionalists, they were a reminder that the family's unique identity was slipping away. These debates played out at gatherings, sometimes gently, sometimes explosively. Yet beneath the arguments, there was still love. No matter how heated the discussions, when illness struck or hardship came, the Calderóns rallied around each other, proving that their unity extended beyond ideology. Their disagreements were real, but so too was their bond. As the decade progressed, Spain itself was changing rapidly. The 1992 Barcelona Olympics showcased a new, vibrant nation to the world, and the Calderóns watched with fascination as their country embraced global recognition. Television broadcasts reached every home, and even in the village, satellite dishes appeared, pulling in images of faraway places that made the world feel smaller. For younger Calderons, these glimpses of the wider world were intoxicating. They dreamed of traveling, of building careers beyond Asturias, of carving identities, not limited by family history. Some followed these dreams, taking jobs abroad or marrying partners from entirely different cultures. This was the most dramatic break yet from the sisters' vision, a transformation of the Calderón lineage into something global. The family, tree that had once curled inward on itself, was now branching outward across borders. Yet, for every departure, there was also a return. Some who left for cities or foreign lands found themselves drawn back years later, seeking the comfort of the familiar village and the support of kin. This cycle of leaving and returning became a new rhythm of Calderón life. Gatherings were now filled with stories of adventures far from Asturias, tales of foreign cities, and children who spoke Spanish with accents influenced by other languages. The family began to embody a paradox, deeply rooted in tradition yet increasingly connected to the world beyond. They were no longer the closed circle of the 1940s, but neither were they entirely free of it. Their identity, though evolving, still carried the weight of the sisters' choices. Throughout the 1990s, one persistent question haunted the Calderons. How much of the past should they carry into the future? Some argued that the story of the sisters should be treated as history, an important but closed chapter. Others believed it was the core of who they were, something that must be honored and preserved no matter the cost. This debate manifested in subtle ways. At family dinners, older members would retell the story of 1938 with reverence, while younger members would listen politely but without the same awe. At weddings, the choice of partner became a symbol of allegiance. Marry within, and you were upholding tradition. Marry outside, and you were writing a new chapter. The family was no longer unified in practice, but it remained unified in passion. No one was indifferent. Whether for or against tradition, everyone cared deeply, and that intensity kept the Calderón identity alive. The physical home of the sisters also played a crucial role during this period. By the 1990s, the old house was showing signs of decay, but it remained the spiritual center of the family. Gatherings there carried immense emotional weight, as if stepping into the house reconnected everyone to the origins of their story. Some family members argued for renovating it, preserving it as a monument to the sisters. Others saw it as a relic of a past that was holding them back. Yet even as debates raged, the house stood, stubbornly enduring like the lineage itself. Children played in its hallways, elders reminisced in its kitchen, and every visitor felt the presence of the women who had started it all. The house became both a blessing and a burden, a symbol of unity and division, a reminder of the power of memory. As the 1990s drew to a close, the Calderons found themselves spread farther than ever before, yet paradoxically still intertwined. Some had broken the cycle completely, others clung to it fiercely, and most lived somewhere in between. But one truth had become undeniable. The story of the sisters could no longer dictate the future. The lineage was evolving, diversifying, reshaping itself in response to a changing world. Whether this was seen as loss or progress depended on who you asked. For some, it was a betrayal of everything the sisters had sacrificed. For others, it was proof that their legacy had given birth to a family strong enough to adapt and survive. In either case, the Calderons entered the new millennium with their identity intact, but transformed, still haunted by the shadows of 1938, yet walking firmly into a future the sisters could never have foreseen. The dawn of the new millennium brought with it a sense of both excitement and unease for the Calderón family. The year 2000 was not simply a change of date. It symbolized an era when technology, globalization, and shifting values accelerated more rapidly than any generation before had experienced. For a family whose story was rooted in tradition and the enduring shadow of four sisters' vow, the 21st century posed a challenge unlike any other. How to remain Calderón in a world that seemed determined to blur boundaries. For some, this was a thrilling prospect, a chance to finally break free from the past. For others, it was terrifying, the final step toward dissolving the sacred circle of kinship that had defined them for 6 decades. At the heart of this new tension was technology. By the early 2000s, mobile phones had become commonplace and the internet began to creep into households. Younger Calderóns, students, professionals, dreamers, quickly embraced these tools, finding in them a doorway to independence. Suddenly, meeting people outside Asturias was easier than ever. Online friendships blossomed, some evolving into romances, and these connections pulled family members further into the global current. For the older generation, this was disorienting. They had spent their lives believing that proximity bred loyalty, that ties to the village were what sustained them. But now grandchildren were falling in love with strangers they had met in Madrid chat rooms or even across oceans. The old ways of courtship, festivals, family introductions, whispered meetings in narrow streets were rapidly being replaced by emails, text messages, and the new phenomenon of video calls. What had once taken weeks of cautious planning could now unfold in hours. To many Calderón elders, this felt like a dangerous acceleration, a breaking of pace that tradition had once carefully dictated. Yet not all elders resisted. Some saw opportunity in these changes. If the family was destined to open up, perhaps technology would allow them to remain connected even while scattered. Indeed, one of the most profound shifts of this era was the creation of digital family groups. Cousins abroad could suddenly send photographs of newborns within minutes of their birth. University students could share their struggles instantly with relatives who offered encouragement. In this way, technology both loosened and reinforced the Calderón identity. It expanded the circle outward, but ensured the voices within it could still echo across distance. The sisters could never have imagined such a thing, yet perhaps they would have approved of the enduring closeness it enabled. With this technological shift came another transformation, the spread of Calderón descendants beyond Spain's borders. By the early 2000s, migration for work and education had carried them to Germany, the United Kingdom, Latin America, and even the United States. Each new branch carried with it the story of the sisters, retold to new friends and partners, often with a mixture of pride and irony. Some Calderóns built lives so far from Asturias that returning to the village became a rare event. Yet they still felt tethered to the family legacy. They taught their children Spanish, visited when they could, and insisted on telling them about the house where 4 sisters had once defied convention to protect their lineage. These retellings turned the sisters into something mythological, not just women of flesh and blood, but symbols of resilience, sacrifice, and an almost legendary stubbornness. For children raised abroad, the story often sounded like a fairy tale, one they could hardly imagine belonging to. And yet, the myth had power. It drew them into a heritage they could claim as uniquely their own. But if globalization offered new opportunities, it also deepened internal divides. Some Calderóns worried that those raised far from Asturias would lose their sense of belonging, treating the family's past as a curiosity rather than a living force. To counter this, efforts were made to hold grand reunions. These gatherings, often planned years in advance, brought cousins from across the globe back to the village. The streets that once echoed with the laughter of children playing under the watchful eyes of the sisters, now filled with a new generation, some speaking Spanish imperfectly, others marveling at the place their parents had described so often. These reunions were bittersweet. On the one hand, they demonstrated that the Calderons, no matter how dispersed, could still come together in spectacular fashion. On the other, they underscored how different the family had become. Conversations flowed in multiple languages, values clashed, and the very definition of what it meant to be a Calderon seemed to be up for debate. Marriage, as always, remained the central battlefield of these debates. By the 2000s, endogamy was no longer the default. The majority of Calderon descendants married outside the lineage, and most did so without hesitation. Still, every such union was met with commentary, sometimes supportive, sometimes critical. For traditionalists, each outside partner represented a further erosion of identity. For progressives, each union was a celebration of freedom. The arguments had evolved from whispers to open discussions, reflecting a society more willing to question authority and tradition. Yet despite these changes, the ghost of the sisters lingered. Their decision in 1938 had set a precedent so powerful that even breaking from it required acknowledging it. No marriage was just a marriage, it was a statement, a choice made in the shadow of history. The house, too, remained a point of contention. By this era, it was aging rapidly, its walls cracked, its roof in need of repair. Some family members lobbied to turn it into a museum of sorts, a space that would preserve the sisters' memory for future generations. Others argued it was impractical, that money was better spent on living needs rather than clinging to the past. Ultimately, compromises were made. Parts of the house were restored, enough to keep it standing, enough to serve as a place of gathering during reunions. For many, stepping into the old home was still an emotional experience, as though they could feel the sisters' presence in the air. For younger descendants, it was less about memory and more about mythology, an ancient site of family power where decisions had once been made that shaped their very existence. The early 2000s also brought Spain into new global crises and opportunities. The euro replaced the peseta, tying Spain more firmly to Europe. Economic fluctuations shaped the lives of many Calderons, some of whom found stability while others struggled. The financial crisis looming toward the end of the decade would hit, especially hard, forcing yet more migration and testing the resilience of the family's unity. Yet even in hardship, the Calderon spirit proved adaptable. Cousins abroad sent money home to those in need. Networks of support expanded across borders, ensuring that no Calderon truly suffered alone. This sense of collective responsibility, though no longer anchored solely in endogamy, carried forward the heart of the sisters' vision. That family must stand together in the face of adversity. By the close of the decade, the Calderon family had become something far more complex than the four sisters could have predicted. They were global, yet deeply tied to a single village. They were modern, yet haunted by tradition. They were fractured by debates, yet bound by love. Some felt a sense of mourning, as though something precious had been lost forever. Others felt exhilaration, convinced that the lineage was stronger than ever, precisely because it had evolved. Both perspectives contained truth. The Calderon story was no longer about preservation alone. It was about adaptation, survival, and the ability to carry memory into the future without being suffocated by it. And so, as the new century unfolded, the Calderon stepped forward with a dual identity, heirs of a closed circle that had once defined them, and pioneers of a new openness that would carry them into generations yet to come. The vow of 1938 was no longer a law, but it remained a legend. And legends, as the Calderons well knew, have a way of outliving everything else. By the second decade of the new millennium, the Calderón family found themselves living in an era where change no longer arrived in waves, but in relentless currents. Smartphones had become extensions of their hands. Social networks blurred the lines between public and private life, and the old rhythms of the village were replaced by a constant hum of notifications, travel, and opportunity. For many, this was thrilling. For others, it was disorienting. But whether they welcomed it or resisted it, every Calderón was forced to reckon with what it meant to belong in a family whose boundaries had become more symbolic than literal. The younger generation, born after 1995, embodied this transformation most vividly. They grew up with stories of the four sisters, but related to them less as real women and more as characters from a family legend. To them, the idea of marrying only within the clan felt as archaic as living without electricity. They valued choice above obligation, freedom above continuity. University life pulled them into diverse circles of friends, lovers, and colleagues. While older Calderóns still whispered about lineage at gatherings, the younger ones often rolled their eyes. To them, family was important but not defining. Identity was something crafted individually, with influences from music, media, and global culture. This generational gap was not unique to the Calderóns, of course, but in their case it cut deeper, because of the weight of the original vow. Yet even as the vow lost its power in practice, it retained its symbolic gravity. It was a reference point, invoked in moments of argument or nostalgia. A cousin marrying a French partner would be teased with remarks like, "The sisters are turning in their graves." A wedding in Madrid, far from Asturias, would still feature a speech reminding the bride and groom of the strength of their lineage. These references were often half-serious, but they mattered. By the early years of the 2020s, the Calderón family had crossed a threshold that none of the four sisters could have imagined when they first sealed their vow nearly a century before. The world had entered a period of upheaval and transformation. Pandemics disrupted borders, economies shook under uncertainty, and technology became not merely a tool, but the very fabric of daily existence. In this new era, the Calderóns found themselves asking not just what it meant to belong to their family, but what it meant to belong to anything at all. The global pandemic of 2020 proved a defining moment. Locked down in cities across the world, Madrid, London, New York, Buenos Aires, the Calderóns, like millions of others, were forced to retreat into the confines of their homes. And yet, in this strange isolation, the family paradoxically became more connected than ever. Daily video calls replaced casual reunions, and cousins who had not spoken in years suddenly found themselves attending the same virtual dinners, laughing across time zones, raising glasses of wine through pixelated screens. WhatsApp groups buzzed with photos of home-cooked meals, jokes, and memories. In those moments, the vow of unity, though stripped of its original form, resurfaced in spirit. They had not chosen to remain together physically, but they had discovered ways to remain present in one another's lives. For the elders, the pandemic revived memories of older crises, the Spanish Civil War, the Hunger Years, the migrations that had scattered their ancestors. They spoke of resilience, of survival through hardship, and reminded the younger generation that difficulty was not new to the Calderóns. For the younger ones, the crisis revealed something different, that family, even fractured and dispersed, could still offer stability in a world of constant uncertainty. They logged into calls not out of obligation, but out of a genuine hunger, for connection, for belonging to something larger than themselves. When restrictions eased, there was a renewed desire for physical gatherings. In 2022, a reunion was organized in Asturias, the first major one since before the pandemic. The village was quieter than ever, many of its streets nearly deserted, but for 1 week it pulsed with life as Calderón descendants returned from every corner of the globe. Some arrived with children who spoke little Spanish, their tongues shaped by English, French, or Portuguese. Yet when they entered the ancestral house, still standing with patched walls and repaired beams, there was a silence that fell over the group. They touched the stone doorframe as though greeting an old friend. They lit candles before the faded photographs of the four sisters, their stern gazes softened by time. And as night fell, music and laughter spilled into the streets, echoing against the empty walls of neighboring houses. It was during this reunion that the family faced the unresolved question of the house's future once again. Its condition was still precarious, despite years of patchwork repairs. Architects advised that restoration would cost more than building anew. Some cousins pressed to sell, others argued fiercely for preservation. The debate nearly fractured. The gathering, voices raised, tears shed. But then, unexpectedly, a compromise emerged, not from the elders, but from the younger generation. They proposed turning the house into a foundation, a cultural space open not just to Calderons, but to anyone interested in family history, migration, and resilience. It would no longer be merely a home. It would be a living archive, a bridge between past and future. The idea sparked excitement. For the first time in years, the family agreed on something, not because it was practical or traditional, but because it gave meaning to their shared story. Funding was raised through a combination of pooled resources and small grants from regional organizations interested in heritage preservation. By 2024, the project began. The house was stabilized, rooms converted into exhibition spaces filled with photographs, letters, and recorded testimonies. One wing became a community hall for local events, another a digital archive accessible to relatives abroad. At the entrance, etched in stone, were the words of the original vow, "We shall remain one." Not as a command, but as a reminder. A phrase open to interpretation, inviting each visitor to ask what unity meant in their own time. The creation of the foundation marked a turning point. It transformed the vow from a restrictive rule into a narrative of endurance. No longer about whom one could or could not marry, it became about remembering, preserving, and adapting. The Calderons were no longer bound by walls but by stories, and the house became the physical symbol of those stories. Relatives who had never known the sisters began to feel their presence not as myth, but as history they could walk through, touch, and understand. As the years unfolded, the Calderons continued to scatter and regroup, to argue and reconcile. Some moved permanently to other continents, starting families with little connection to Spain beyond the occasional reunion. Others returned to Asturias, buying nearby houses, raising children in the shadow of the ancestral home. The diversity of paths was immense, but each carried within it a thread of recognition that they were part of a tapestry woven generations before. By the time the centenary of the vow approached in 2038, preparations began for a grand commemoration. Plans included a documentary chronicling the family's journey, exhibitions displaying heirlooms, and performances by descendants who had become musicians, writers, and artists. It was to be not just a Calderon event, but a public celebration of how one family's private decision had rippled outward through history. Invitations were extended across continents to cousins who had not returned in decades. The gathering promised to be the largest since the vow was first spoken. In the build-up to the centenary, many younger Calderons reflected on the meaning of it all. To them, the vow no longer carried the weight of restriction. It had become instead a metaphor for resilience, continuity, and adaptation. One young writer, a great-great-granddaughter of one of the sisters, articulated it best when she said, "The vow was never really about marriage. It was about survival. They promised to hold on to each other so they wouldn't disappear. And in a way, we still haven't." When the centenary arrived, the village of Asturias once again overflowed with Calderons. Streets filled with music, The ancestral house shone with lights, and the air was thick with the scent of food and wine. Inside the house, a silent moment was held before the sisters' portraits. Hundreds of descendants, from toddlers to elders in wheelchairs, stood shoulder to shoulder. For a moment, there was no distance of geography or time, only presence. Then, one by one, voices began to sing an old Asturian folk song that the sisters themselves had sung in their youth. The melody rose, filling the house, spilling into the streets, and carrying across the hills. It was in that moment, perhaps more than any other, that the meaning of the vow revealed itself fully. It was not about keeping bloodlines pure or preserving rigid tradition. It was about remembering that they belonged to one another, across generations, across distances, across differences. And though the vow had been broken in its original form long ago, its spirit had endured, reshaped, reinterpreted, and renewed. As the night ended and fireworks lit the sky, cousins embraced, tears glistening in their eyes. Some knew they might never return, that life would scatter them once again. But all carried with them the certainty that the Calderón story was not merely past. It was alive, and it would continue. And so, from a vow whispered in a small Asturian village in 1938, a century-long saga unfolded of resilience, migration, love, conflict, and memory. The four sisters had sought to protect their family from dissolution, and though their vow could not freeze time, it had succeeded in something far greater. It had created a story strong enough to bind generations together, not through rules, but through remembrance. In the end, that was the true legacy of the Calderón family. Not the walls of a house, not the limits of a vow, but the enduring belief that to remain one is not to remain the same, but to remain connected. By the early years of the 2020s, the Calderón family had crossed a threshold that none of the four sisters could have imagined when they first sealed their vow nearly a century before. The world had entered a period of upheaval and transformation. Pandemics disrupted borders, economies shook under uncertainty, and technology became not merely a tool, but the very fabric of daily existence. In this new era, the Calderóns found themselves asking not just what it meant to belong to their family, but what it meant to belong to anything at all. The global pandemic of 2020 proved a defining moment. Locked down in cities across the world, Madrid, London, New York, Buenos Aires, the Calderóns, like millions of others, were forced to retreat into the confines of their homes. And yet, in this strange isolation, the family paradoxically became more connected than ever. Daily video calls replaced casual reunions, and cousins who had not spoken in years suddenly found themselves attending the same virtual dinners, laughing across time zones, raising glasses of wine through pixelated screens. WhatsApp groups buzzed with photos of home-cooked meals, jokes, and memories. In those moments, the vow of unity, though stripped of its original form, resurfaced in spirit. They had not chosen to remain together physically, but they had discovered ways to remain present in one another's lives. For the elders, the pandemic revived memories of older crises, the Spanish Civil War, the Hunger Years, the migrations that had scattered their ancestors. They spoke of resilience, of survival through hardship, and reminded the younger generation that difficulty was not new to the Calderons. For the younger ones, the crisis revealed something different. That family, even fractured and dispersed, could still offer stability in a world of constant uncertainty. They logged into calls not out of obligation but out of a genuine hunger for connection, for belonging to something larger than themselves. When restrictions eased, there was a renewed desire for physical gatherings. In 2022, a reunion was organized in Asturias, the first major one since before the pandemic. The village was quieter than ever, many of its streets nearly deserted, but for 1 week it pulsed with life as Calderón descendants returned from every corner of the globe. Some arrived with children who spoke little Spanish, their tongues shaped by English, French, or Portuguese. Yet when they entered the ancestral house, still standing with patched walls and repaired beams, there was a silence that fell over the group. They touched the stone doorframe as though greeting an old friend. They lit candles before the faded photographs of the four sisters, their stern gazes softened by time. And as night fell, music and laughter spilled into the streets, echoing against the empty walls of neighboring houses. It was during this reunion that the family faced the unresolved question of the house's future once again. Its condition was still precarious, despite years of patchwork repairs. Architects advised that restoration would cost more than building anew. Some cousins pressed to sell, others argued fiercely for preservation. The debate nearly fractured. The gathering, voices raised, tears shed. But then, unexpectedly, a compromise emerged, not from the elders, but from the younger generation. They proposed turning the house into a foundation, a cultural space open not just to Calderons, but to anyone interested in family history, migration, and resilience. It would no longer be merely a home. It would be a living archive, a bridge between past and future. The idea sparked excitement. For the first time in years, the family agreed on something, not because it was practical or traditional, but because it gave meaning to their shared story. Funding was raised through a combination of pooled resources and small grants from regional organizations interested in heritage preservation. By 2024, the project began. The house was stabilized, rooms converted into exhibition spaces filled with photographs, letters, and recorded testimonies. One wing became a community hall for local events, another a digital archive accessible to relatives abroad. At the entrance, etched in stone, were the words of the original vow, "We shall remain one," not as a command, but as a reminder, a phrase open to interpretation, inviting each visitor to ask what unity meant in their own time. The creation of the foundation marked a turning point. It transformed the vow from a restrictive rule into a narrative of endurance. No longer about whom one could or could not marry, it became about remembering, preserving, and adapting. The Calderons were no longer bound by walls, but by stories, and the house became the physical symbol of those stories. Relatives who had never known the sisters began to feel their presence not as myth, but as history they could walk through, touch, and understand. As the years unfolded, the Calderons continued to scatter and regroup, to argue and reconcile. Some moved permanently to other continents, starting families with little connection to Spain beyond the occasional reunion. Others returned to Asturias, buying nearby houses, raising children in the shadow of the ancestral home. The diversity of paths was immense, but each carried within it a thread of recognition that they were part of a tapestry woven generations before. By the time the centenary of the vow approached in 2038, preparations began for a grand commemoration. Plans included a documentary chronicling the family's journey, exhibitions displaying heirlooms, and performances by descendants who had become musicians, writers, and artists. It was to be not just a Calderón event, but a public celebration of how one family's private decision had rippled outward through history. Invitations were extended across continents to cousins who had not returned in decades. The gathering promised to be the largest since the vow was first spoken. In the build-up to the centenary, many younger Calderóns reflected on the meaning of it all. To them, the vow no longer carried the weight of restriction. It had become instead a metaphor for resilience, continuity, and adaptation. One young writer, a great-great-granddaughter of one of the sisters, articulated it best when she said, "The vow was never really about marriage. It was about survival. They promised to hold on to each other so they wouldn't disappear. And in a way, we still haven't." When the centenary arrived, the village of Asturias once again overflowed with Calderóns. Streets filled with music. The ancestral house shone with lights, and the air was thick with the scent of food and wine. Inside the house, a silent moment was held before the sisters' portraits. Hundreds of descendants, from toddlers to elders in wheelchairs, stood shoulder to shoulder. For a moment, there was no distance of geography or time, only presence. Then, one by one, voices began to sing an old Asturian folk song that the sisters themselves had sung in their youth. The melody rose, filling the house, spilling into the streets and carrying across the hills. It was in that moment, perhaps more than any other, that the meaning of the vow revealed itself fully. It was not about keeping bloodlines pure or preserving rigid tradition. It was about remembering that they belonged to one another across generations, across distances, across differences. And though the vow had been broken in its original form long ago, its spirit had endured, reshaped, reinterpreted, and renewed. As the night ended and fireworks lit the sky, cousins embraced, tears glistening in their eyes. Some knew they might never return, that life would scatter them once again. But all carried with them the certainty that the Calderón story was not merely past. It was alive, and it would continue. And so, from a vow whispered in a small Asturian village in 1938, a century-long saga unfolded of resilience, migration, love, conflict, and memory. The four sisters had sought to protect their family from dissolution, and though their vow could not freeze time, it had succeeded in something far greater. It had created a story strong enough to bind generations together, not through rules, but through remembrance. In the end, that was the true legacy of the Calderón family, not the walls of a house, not the limits of a vow, but the enduring belief that to remain one is not to remain the same, but to remain connected.